When people are asked about World War II, they normally think of the Nazis fighting Britain, France, and the US. But there is a lot more to World War II than that. And that is what these are going to be about. For the next however many, well, this is the last one actually, I will be explaining the main three fronts of the Second World War. On this displayed map, in blue is what was in the first documentary, in red is what was in the second, and what was in the green will be in this documentary. So today we will be talking about the Pacific Theatre and the war against Japan in China, and obviously in the Pacific. So without any further diversions, let us begin. For 200 years, Japan declared a state of isolationism, completely cutting itself off from the outside world. No one entered, no one left. If anyone tried to land on Japanese soil, thinking that they discovered riches, then they would be arrested and killed for reasons relating to the isolationism. It wouldn't be until 1853 when American Captain Admiral Matthew Perry landed on Japanese soil accompanied with 4 warships. Now, the Japanese had never seen anything like it, and the Admiral demanded that the Japanese open trade with the West or be invaded. He gave the Japanese a year to decide and promised to return with more ships. The year passed and 10 US warships approached Japanese shores, where the Japanese isolation ended and trade was established. Now, over in the West, they had been experiencing the Industrial Revolution, while Japan was still living with the shogunate society and the samurai. This changed very quickly. The Japanese stunned the West by industrializing in only 30 years, the quickest in the world at the time. The statue of the samurai heavily opposed this change of industrialization and began fighting for the preservation of Japanese culture before the industrialization happened. This didn't go to plan, and the samurai in physical form were wiped out, and the Japanese Empire had been born. Now, obviously, when you look into the West for ideas, what have you got in the West? Empires. So Japan wanted an empire of its own. And this imperial expansion started with the first Sino-Japanese War, which resulted in a Japanese victory and saw the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, and sections of the area on the north of the Yellow Sea were ceded to the Japanese Empire, and the reputation of the Qing Empire was crushed. Thanks to the Japanese, other spheres of influence were set up in China, from the British to the Germans to the Russians to the French and the Portuguese. It would be these imperial rivalries that would spark the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 over the territory of Manchuria. Now, Japan stunned the world in the Russo-Japanese War as they actually won against Russia in 1905. And this then led to the 1905 revolution, which is the beginning of the end of the Tsardom in Russia. Now, Japan, although a minor part, would take part in World War I on the side of the Entente, and would help by taking Germany's Pacific colonies for their own. But it would be after World War I that the Japanese would seek more. After the First World War, Japan would be one of the many nations to enter the League of Nations, which was, for those who don't know, a prototype UN. However, the Japanese wanted more land, so they decided to go after the state of Manchuria, which is located north of the Korean Peninsula, and they captured it and set up the puppet state of Manchukuo and installed Aisin Puyi, who was next in line for the Qing dynasty. He was actually put on the throne at only 2 years as head of the puppet state. Now, many in the League of Nations protested against this action and demanded that Japan withdraw from Manchuria. But Japan decided to one-up them and left the League of Nations and continued its conquest. Now, at this point, it's the 1930s, and the Chinese Civil War was more than underway. And Japan needed some land in China for resources and land. So, Japan decided to stage an incident at the Marco Polo Bridge, where Chinese troops fired upon Japanese troops doing a parade exercise. Seeing this as an act of war, Japan therefore started the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Now, on the Chinese side, Chiang Kai-shek was hesitant about allying with the communists, even though Mao was like, align with us and we'll help you. Chiang Kai-shek didn't want the alliance, and thus the Japanese just rinsed through the whole of the northeast coast, and it was then when the Second United Front was born. Now, along the period of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Soviets would experience border conflicts from the Japanese, sort of testing their strength. But by 1941, the Japanese had asked for a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. Back to the conquest in China, and the Japanese raced through Beijing, raced through the north, all the way down the coast until Nanking. Now, the war would turn into a guerrilla war, but Nanking saw the worst of the Japanese atrocities, including the Nanking Massacre. Now, this war would last for another 8 years, and for all those 8 years there'd be minor territory changes apart from the last few weeks. But the war in Europe was starting to come to a head. By 1941, Japan's resource situation was in desperate need of a resupply, and the areas of South Asia were rich with resources. Now, they chose to go after South Asia and not help Germany in the Soviets, in their war with the Soviets, because the border conflicts showed that the Soviets were a bit more prepared than the Japanese had fought. That's why they signed the armistice. So they looked to the south, which were rich in resources, but South Asia was controlled by the British, the Netherlands, the United States, and Portugal, and France. So Japan needed a way to attack these countries to gain the areas of Malaysia, Indochina, and the Philippines, along with other possible targets. Having learned from the border conflicts, as I explained earlier, they knew they had to go south, using the doctrine of, I'm gonna butcher this, Totsugeki Raigeki, which translates to lightning attack. It's a Japanese blitzkrieg, basically. But they knew that Japan's navy could not stand to the navy of the US and the Royal Navy. And they gambled and worked out that they could sustain a war for 6 months against the Brits and the Americans without delay. So they planned to invade Hong Kong, Indonesia, the Philippines, Wake Island, and the rest of South Asia. Admiral Yamamoto would lead a task force of the Japanese Navy to the island of Hawaii to commence the attack. Now, the United States had stationed their Pacific Fleet at the base of Pearl Harbor on the island of Honolulu on the island of Hawaii. The US were holding a military parade on the morning of December 7th. Little to their knowledge, squadron of Japanese aircraft were heading for Pearl Harbor. Now, the US actually detected the Japanese squadrons, but they thought it was a squadron of B-17s coming into land who was doing an exercise. So they thought nothing of it. And earlier today, a Japanese sub had been destroyed by an American destroyer. So they thought nothing of it. Minutes before the attack, one Japanese pilot radioed the words "Tora, Tora, Tora," and the attack on Pearl Harbor began. Now, the code Tora, Tora, Tora was the indication that the attack was completely to the Allies' surprise, undetected and undefended. And also, Tora stands for lion, and in this case, it's also shortened for the lightning attack, which I'm not going to pronounce again. Now, on the 8th of December, the Japanese would attack Hong Kong and Wake Island, and then proceed through the rest of that operation. If the attack on Pearl Harbor didn't go to plan, then there would only be one other option, and that would for the Japanese ambassador in America to hand over the declaration of war at 1:00 p.m. But the attack went as planned, and they managed, throughout the whole attack, they managed to take Hong Kong, Indochina, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, most of the Pacific Islands, and even touch with the borders of India. But this would be the most land that the Japanese would gain throughout World War II. And it would begin the end of the Imperial Japanese Empire. Admiral Yamamoto knew that they couldn't beat the US and British navies. And while not officially said, but now it's officially said, he said that they have done nothing but awake an iron giant. This can be seen in Pearl Harbor, Tora, 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 and on his gravestone. He didn't actually say it, but they put it in, and now it's canon. He predicted that they would be able to win for 6 months before the end would begin. And that end would start at the Battle of Midway. I have a dedicated video to the Battle of Midway in my playlist, which I will leave below. The Japanese would target the American island of Midway to gain a strategic point for a possible invasion of Hawaii. Midway was an airbase. It had a sizable garrison on it, and it also had a brilliant airstrip. But there were two factors to the Japanese defeat. One, the US had decrypted the attack and sent a task force to engage the Japanese fleet heading to the island. B, if the Japanese had even remotely won at sea, the land attack would have been devastating. So, in theory, there would have been no way for the Japanese to win at Midway. But the battle ended with a US victory by the task force, the sorties that were flown, destroying all 4 carriers the Japanese had, crippling the Japanese Navy beyond repair, and began the collapse of the Japanese Empire. Now the operation of the US Marines island hopping up to the mainland began. I'm going to turn a bit from strategy for a while to talk about the Japanese beliefs, because the Japanese are Japanese culture is one of the best cultures to look at, and their beliefs during the Second World War was unremarkable. So, as the Japanese began to dig themselves in and prepared to possibly wait the war out, not like they could ever retreat, the Japanese people may have stopped the samurai having the rights they once had and may have crippled them in physical form, but the belief of that old Japanese society still lived on. The belief was that dying in honor for your country in combat or by kamikaze was the most respectful thing a soldier could do for his family. Surrender was considered the most dishonourable thing to ever do. And it was seen better to kill yourself, even if you would not experience combat, even if you were a general and you were looking at the maps and you were thinking, God, we can't win this, we might want to retreat to a different island. No. They had to kill themselves. Now, this can be very, very well represented in the poem Kamikaze. What it dictates is a kamikaze pilot sent on a mission, but he decided to turn back and to live a long life rather than die young. The poem goes on to state that the people, his family, expelled him from their lives. Only the children would speak to him because they didn't really know Japanese tradition. And then once they got old enough, they too ignored him and expelled him from their life. Until, eventually, he might as well basically have just killed himself. He was that exiled. But this is what would happen to someone who either surrendered or did not fulfill the order of Emperor Hirohito. As the American island hopping got closer to the Japanese mainland, island after island, the US Marines encountered resistance more fierce than the previous island. This first show of fierce force was shown at Saipan. But the American advance in the Pacific was also helped by the British and Indian advance in Burma. So they were being pushed back on two fronts. The Japanese Empire was falling at the seams, just like the German Reich. And it would be in 1944 when the kamikaze attacks on Naval Task Force would begin. Out of the percentage of ones that succeeded and the percentage that and the number that was sent, there was a hugely ineffective strategy using these kamikaze pilots at this late stage in the war, due to improvements in anti-air armaments. Now, as I dictated before, Saipan would be one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, followed by Iwo Jima and finally Okinawa. But the Americans and some British scientists had been working on a new weapon, and it was tested on July 10th, 1945 at 5:30 a.m. in New Mexico. It was ready to use. Now, the capture of Iwo Jima allowed the Americans to use the airfield on Iwo Jima to launch firebombing campaigns against the Japanese homeland, targeting villages, because they were usually made of wood, wooden huts, as you would expect. But the time had come, and the B-29 Superfortress, named Enola Gay after the pilot's mother, took flight towards the city of Hiroshima for a fate with destiny and a scripture in history books, dropping the first atomic bomb on August 6th, 1945, and would take flight again 3 days later, but this time heading for Nagasaki to drop the second and last nuclear bomb to be used in wartime. The decision to use the A-bomb was not a difficult one. Now the Soviets were advancing into Manchuria, the Americans had to make a choice. Either commence Operation Downfall, which was an invasion of the Japanese homeland, which would have been more brutal than all of the Pacific campaign combined, with the Americans coming in from the south and the Soviets coming in from the north, or they just used the A-bomb and hope they surrender. So they went with the latter option, and these two bombs caused the most rapid withdrawal of Japanese troops in history. So quick that the Chinese Kuomintang and the CPC raced to grab the most land as the Japanese withdrew to gain power in the coming civil war that would be reignited in 46. But it wouldn't be till the 2nd of September when the fateful day had come. Now, Emperor Hirohito stated in April 1942 that the fruits of victory are tumbling into our mouths too quickly, meaning that Japan was taking too much too fast. But in August 1945, he stated, the war has developed not necessarily into Japan's advantage. And on the 2nd of September, the Japanese sent the official surrender to the Allied command. Now, during the period following World War II, Japan would be military occupied. And who better to take this position than General Douglas MacArthur? Now, on the day of the Japanese surrender, he demanded a photo taken with him and Emperor Hirohito, and then posted in the Japanese newspapers the following day, showing them that the Emperor wasn't as great a man as the Japanese people thought he was. And then Truman decided, let's give a VJ Day speech. Victory in Japan. Now, as I said earlier, Japan would be put under military occupation by the US until the Korean War, when they had other things to do. But taking a look past World War II for a minute, the Japanese realised that their 50-year occupation of Korea saw the Korean people get absolutely butchered. And still to this day, 80 years on, well, 79 at the making of this video, the Japanese still apologise to the Koreans for what they'd done. But for the Allied soldiers, they did not. For the prisoners of war that they took, that they starved and forced to do labour, they will not apologise for that. And I'm guessing for like their tradition, their culture, their way of life. But that is not for me to dictate. And what happened after World War II is to be saved for another documentary. Thank you so much for if you have watched all three, then thank you very much. If you've just watched this one, and I suggest going back and watching the other two, I will leave links to them down in the description. I really wanted to try out a documentary style video to sort of give something a little different, as I can put my efforts into a 2-week video instead of uploading 3 a week, doing 3 videos in one day on the Sunday to upload across the week. So thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you want to stay tuned with more. I guess I'm a war historian now, so I guess that's okay. If you have subscribed and you're not getting notifications, then click the bell button and you'll get an email saying that there's a new video of mine. But until the next video, this has been your War Historian Beast, signing off.